Welcome everyone to this global webinar series as the third webinar in the series, a series of six, or at least the initial series of six. Juvaria and I have already started planning the next series of six, and we have many exciting topics to come, including the idea of China, as well as white supremacy and world politics, and two or three others I can't now remember the titles of. But welcome and thank you everyone for attending. And as you may know if you've been following it, but if you haven't, this is a kind of webinar series we've set up in order to try to, if you like, look at the different kind of attitudes and perspectives and knowledge and research that people are doing around the world on some of the big questions, and try to create a forum where we can bring together into the same room people who may not necessarily meet in panels on conferences because of disciplinary issues, uh, theoretical differences, as well as methodological and other differences as well. So the idea really is, regardless of global location, regardless of theoretical perspective, as long as people have got some interesting things to say from a diverse set of backgrounds, then we would like to provide a forum in order to illuminate that there are different sources of knowledge, different understandings of how the world works, different theoretical traditions in different parts of the world, and completely different experiences from which people come to any particular question. So the idea being, it is kind of effectively to democratize uh, discussion using a platform which has become to most of us very recently available, Zoom, and which can thereby help us to connect with people from all around the world at the same time at the minimum of cost. And so basically we are able to do this and try to discuss the big issue, or if you like, the big kind of banner is global conversations on the international system of power. So, and that includes not only institutions and regimes, but it also includes like what we're going to talk about today, which is really the kind of emergence around the world at very similar kind of time periods, right-wing authoritarian populism, which has sprung up in global north and global south, each with its own historical and national and regional tradition, but also each with a number of similarities, or it would appear to be. And I'm sure, like most of you, we speak about the rise of right-wing populism, and we often throw out several names as instances to kind of clarify what we're talking about. And Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro, Modi, and so on come very easily to mind. And so today's panel is particularly interesting because we have people from scholars from different parts of the world and looking at different sort of manifestations and of this kind of phenomenon. And it'll be interesting to see to what extent these names we throw out and these tendencies actually are similar, or how they may differ, because we tend to sort of lump them together in one kind of thing, right-wing populism. And I'll be interested to hear the details of how your analysis have actually helped to kind of provide a richer texture, empirical knowledge, in order for us to maybe to be able to understand and see if these are comparative or contrasting phenomena. So really pleased, and Juvaria is going to now move forward in a moment when I've stopped jabbing wrong, uh, to introduce our speakers. But I just want to say thank you to those five groups which now support this webinar series. Of course, we have Felipe, who represents OPEU INEU from Brazil, which is a primary association of the scholars of US politics, political economy, and history in Brazil. We have LSE Ideas, which supports this as the foreign policy think tank from that university. Center for International Policy Studies at City University, of course, the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, which is a really exciting new venture in trying to sort of promote global South social science thinking, as well as to connect global North and global South scholars in that regard. And of course, the University of West London, where one of our alumni, Dr. Bamo Nuri, now teaches, and who is extending that network to a larger group of people. So thank you very much to all of those. And the final thing I'll say is before I hand over to Juvaria is that we will be publishing working papers from our, if our speakers would wish to contribute to that series in order to make that knowledge more widely available afterwards in written form as a way of like a teaching resource in order to help to diversify the curriculum, provide new voices for our students and so on. And we are also recording this webinar, and we, as we did for the one 2 weeks ago, we will distribute via email and Twitter and so on. And we are trying to crack the IT problem of doing podcasts as well. So with that, I'll hand over to Juvaria to please introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Inderjeet. I'll start with Madura, and I think this will correspond with the order in which they'll speak. So Dr. Madura Rasaratnam is based at City, University of London, where she is lecturer in comparative politics. Her research interests are in the areas of conflict, conflict management, and international interventions with a regional focus on the countries of South Asia, specifically India and Sri Lanka. Her book, Tamils and the Nation, India and Sri Lanka Compared, was published by the Oxford University Press in 2016. It is a detailed comparative study of the starkly divergent trajectories of the Tamil question in India and Sri Lanka from the colonial era to the present day. And it locates the distinct patterns of nationalist mobilization and contestation in both countries in the dynamics of changing international contexts. Madura will be presenting with Moyukh, who I will just introduce now. M.Chatterjee is based at Middlebury College in Vermont. He's currently working on an ethnography of majoritarian state formation in India. His research is on the ethnography of law, violence, state, and politics, and he examines how violence expands our notions of politics and democracy, particularly to understand the relationship between collective violence, power, legitimacy, and political power in India. His recent publications are discussions of Hindu nationalism, state power, and majoritarian rule. And he and Madura today will speak about democracies in crisis, post-colonial perspectives from India and the UK. We also have with us today Felipe Louriero, who is an associate professor at the Institute of International Relations at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He works on the history of international relations, particularly on the Cold War and its impacts on Brazil and Latin America as a whole. He also works on the history of the United States and on American studies, focusing on US political institutions from World War II to the present. His talk title is To Save the World from Communism, Conspiracy Theories and the Foreign Policy of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro. And we also have Dr. Rima, who's a lecturer in the Department of Criminology and Sociology at Middlesex University. Rima's research and teaching interests are in quantitative and mixed research methods in the social sciences and sociology of race and ethnicity, as well as migration and class. She's also a co-convener of the British Sociological Association and the Race and Ethnicity Study Group particularly, sorry. Her recent publications are on racial identity and inequality in Black and Asian middle classes and on decolonizing the curriculum. Her talk title is Political Consciousness and Party Identity in British South Asian. Sorry. Thank you for joining us today, everyone.
Okay, so Madura and Moyukh, please do make a start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you so much, Juvaria and Inderjeet, for inviting me to share my thoughts. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and especially the comparative framework that Inderjeet you mentioned, which I think would be really valuable to understand the crisis that Madura and I will be talking about. So just to give you a brief background, the talk or the paper, which is actually a paper that we're working on, started off as part of a workshop that brought scholars from the UK and India, a British Academy workshop. I'll just quickly put a timer. I don't want to go over time. In Delhi, which was on violence and democracy, and the workshop was an effort to really understand the relationship between violence and democracy in a couple of ways. the uses of violence within democracies, the transition between violence and order or peace within democratic societies, and also the ways that violence and democracy sort of co-constitute each other, and sort of help us understand perhaps democracy in a sort of non-normative, or unconventional way. So that was the background behind the paper that I'll be presenting. So without further ado, I'll share my desktop. I hope everyone can see the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so broadly, I'll do the first three sections of our presentation. I'll briefly state the problem, our questions, and the case of India, and Madura will sort of bring it to Britain, and she will conclude. Okay, so the crisis. Now, the current crisis of democracy seemed to us an opportunity, a certain kind of a unique opportunity, perhaps, in so far as for a long time it was possible to think of questions of crisis, failure, immaturity, weakness, fragility as something that happens out there. So, just to give a quick anecdote, in my classes back in the day, when I was studying the history of philosophy, our teacher was teaching Hobbes in the state of nature. And at some point, she said, the state of nature is not an abstract thing. And she said, have you seen the news in Zimbabwe about the violence, about the violence that was happening before the elections? And she just left it there. And even at that moment, I was thinking, what would it be like to think, or can we even think of democracy, of this idea of Western modernity and order without having Zimbabwe, without having this other. So the current crisis is unique insofar as Trumpism and Brexit, and of course other instances in Europe push us really hard to sort of leave the idea, or perhaps try to begin to leave the idea that there is that the West is the norm and the ideal, and the rest of the world is the exception. So when Hindu nationalists destroyed a mosque in public view in 1992, it's something to do with India, it's the pathology of Indian religion or something like that. But when we have protesters storming the Capitol in the US, we are forced to think of it in a different way. So I'm just giving you some of the names that this crisis has been labeled, but our interest is not in the labels, but to think of this in a different way. So the question that we posed to ourselves was, what would this crisis look like if we looked at it from what I'm calling a post-colonial perspective? And what can post-colonial theory and the democratic experience, the political experience, the political languages, the political processes in other parts of the world, the deviations till now, can they help us understand this crisis better? Before I get into what we are describing as a post-colonial approach, let me just give you a very brief and rough sketch of what would be the normative approach. So the normative approaches to violence within democracies, or the question of violence in general, has been, it's pre-modern, it's an aberration, it's an exception. So, and the conventional framework to understand this, which is the liberalism, is that the violence is the political philosophy, or the ideas that we have sort of try their best to govern and corral and sort of subdue this violence. And from time to time, it sort of erupts, and it's just an exception. And it is that the violence and democratic practices and procedures are antithetical. They belong to two different worlds. As opposed to that, I think what we are calling a post-colonial approach. So I'll give you some brief, a brief overview of some of the approaches, and then move to the one that we find most persuasive, or the one that we are kind of working with at this moment. So the first is M.Chatterjee in his work, sort of argues that he uses Bentham's idea of the British case as the norm, and which sort of explains, the deviations in other parts of the world. So that's what that's what we mean when we see today the crisis is an opportunity, because you cannot any longer think of the US as the norm. So Trumpism or Brexit does not allow that. So once we move away from that it sort of opens a new terrain. So what kind of thinking about democracy is possible in that terrain? So the other perspectives, I'm here thinking of Achille Bembe, who writes from the context of Africa, and so he sort of argues for the co-emergence of what is the theoretical edifice of democracy and liberalism with slavery. So the plantation and the constitution are two sides of one coin. They are not contradictions. They are, like, I think Bembe calls them the solar and the nocturnal, the sun and the moon. So the two sides of this phenomena. And similarly, the canonical work by Uday Mehta and others who have done the same work for liberalism and shown its ability to exist and flourish in conditions of extreme violence. And finally, the approach that we will be sort of working with today is the idea that there is a split within democracies, and which is two people I'm just mentioning, but it is many post-colonial theorists work with this idea. Sudipto Kaviraj and D.R. Nagaraj are the two ones that we use, who write from the context of India, that there is a split within democracy, a split of languages, a split of a grammar, of a political grammar, and that split kind of widens and transforms with time, and that split is a key aspect we are arguing to understand the current crisis of democracy. Okay, so my case, I quickly, with the time I have, is Hindu nationalism. And so the conventional view of Hindu nationalism and Hindu supremacy could, of course, be that it's an aberration, either to the, just like US exceptionalism, we can have some idea of fantasy of Indian exceptionalism as a tolerant Hindu country, and all that goes with that worldview. Thankfully, the rise of Modi and has helped us think beyond that. And what we get here is, and this I borrow here from Sudipto Kaviraj's idea that during independence, when India got independence in 1947, there was a split in the political grammar of the country, which was that the state and the official languages of secularism and the rule of the law coexisted, or were sort of existed at one level, but at another level, along with that, there existed questions of caste and religious symbolism, including Hindu nationalism that was developed during the anti-colonial struggle. So the post-colonial experience of democracy means that both these levels coexist, and despite the enthusiasm, the enthusiasm and the dream of people like Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, but a whole range of post-colonial leaders and intellectuals, that the other level, the vernacular, the popular, the other level would just disappear over time. That never happened. In fact, we see that it was this split continued, endured, transformed, and took various shapes. So my argument is, our argument is that if we look at Hindu nationalism as a sort of, as an enduring sediment of Indian politics, let us think of it as a chest, as a repository of images, metaphors, symbols that give India a shape and can allow it to have the people. And this is, of course, in the idea of the Hindu goddesses, Hindu gods. And then this sediment has been used by political parties, both right and left in India, since its time of independence. It's used by both state officials and non-state officials like common people. It's used in public places. It's used in processions, and it is an integral part of the public sphere. It is an integral part of the way that people make claims to the state, as well as they express their grievances. And therefore, what would be considered, or what could be considered as a collapse of Indian democracy, or the rise of Hindu supremacy, or the sort of resurgence of Hindu supremacy, could perhaps also be seen as a re-enchanting of democratic politics, as a mode, or as a one way that these two splits, that these two levels of politics are being reconciled or fused. Thank you. I will turn over to Madura.
Madura, you're muted still.
Okay, there we go. So I guess I'll thank you, Moyukh. So I guess I'll start my screen. This one I think is probably the right one. Okay. Can you all see that? Yeah. Great. Okay. So so Moyukh's given you a good overview of the sort of framework that we're working within, and thinking about India and Britain as kind of comparative cases, but also connected cases, right? So they're cases that are connected by this shared colonial history, but thinking about the British experience not as the norm, but through the framework developed by kind of post-colonial thinkers in trying to engage with the ways in which Indian democracy has worked out. And so the question that we then, when we look at British democracy, is that can this idea of a split in the kind of different grammars of politics, that there are various grammars of politics at play in any democracy, can this idea of a split in the language of politics help explain the salience of race in British politics, and in particular the salience of race that seemed to kind of emerge or erupt in the way that we often think of Hindu nationalism erupting around the time of Brexit. And for those of you who are in Britain and who follow British politics, this is now like the iconic image of Brexit. So if you don't know, this is Nigel Farage, who is a populist kind of leader of the leader of the movement that really kind of can take credit for the victory of the Leave movement to leave the European Union. But what's really important, of course, is that the movement to leave the European Union was not about customs or trade barriers or any of these things, or about a kind of multilateral institution. It was actually kind of mainly about immigration. And so he stood in front of this poster. This was revealed in the kind of final months of the Brexit vote, saying that, we're at breaking point, the EU has failed us. And the idea, of course, is this hordes of people are trying to kind of swamp into Britain. And the image is actually an image of refugees who are fleeing conflict from the Middle East, from Syria. And it's very telling, of course, that almost all of them are brown, and they're all men, brown men. So there's a very racialized, sexualized image of the kind of the threat that Britain is under as a result of Brexit. So that's kind of the inflection of race in British politics in the contemporary era. So how do we make sense?
Madura, sorry to interrupt. Is it possible to switch to presentation mode?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. Is that easier? Let me see if I can do that. Present. Yeah, is that better? Yeah. Okay, great. So, if we think about Britain as a post-colonial state, then Britain itself having been formed by the experiences of empire just as much as India was formed by the experiences of empire as well. This shared history, the connected history. So, if we think in those terms, and we think about the emergence of democracy, I'll get to the image in a second, but the idea of race is then core to late 19th century elite and popular conceptions of the people in Britain. So whereas in India, the colonial experience, or the kind of the thinness, as Kaviraj would call it, of colonial modernity led to a split between the elite and the popular, because colonial modernity kind of only sort of sat at the atop the rest of India. In Britain, modernity was not thin in that way, right? It was quite thickly infused, but it was also very racial. So for elites, the idea of democracy, the idea of liberalism, the idea of the people is built around these kind of intellectual trends of Anglo-Saxonism, social Darwinism, etc., liberal imperialism that are unpicked by people like Uday Mehta and others. But at the vernacular level also, the idea of the people and the idea of empire and the idea of race are also kind of important to the constitution of the people in vernacular ideas through things like commodity advertising. So this is, it comes from the work of McClintock, who's looked at this, the constitution of popular conceptions of peoplehood, race, and empire, and, sexuality and gender in the late 19th century. And she looks at things like Pear's soap advertisements. So people, at the vernacular level, people weren't reading about Anglo-Saxonism, but they did have commodity advertising. And so this is late 19th century, mid 19th century advertising for soap. And you can see, of course, the very clear idea of whiteness being good and soap being used to cleanse kind of the black child of its blackness and become magically transformed into white. So this everyday kind of practices imbued ideas of whiteness, and other things such as the royal family, the importance of the royal family as a kind of national symbol. We can talk about the current sort of ruptures around Meghan Markle, very much linked to this era. So this kind of, there's a big literature which shows us that popular conceptions of peoplehood, nationhood congealed around whiteness in this time. This is Lake and Reynolds on, the global color line. Okay, so liberal democracy formed around ideals of whiteness in the late 19th century. So the split emerges in the kind of the traumas of decolonization and the traumas of the challenges to empire that emerge in the early part of the 20th century. And it's therefore it's a post-colonial split in the language of British democracy. And so there's a contested deracialization of empire and imperial elites from the 1930s, not uniform, but it begins from the 1930s onwards. Number of factors. It's not, there's a lot of historiography that says it's not actually just a kind of reaction to the horrors of Nazi rule. It starts earlier and through the pressures of anti-colonial resistance, including, for example, self-rule for India. So if you the historiography of India in 1905 or 1910, when Lord Curzon is the viceroy, absolutely balks at any idea of concessions to Indian demands for self-rule. But by the 1930s, the viceroy then, which is Irwin, has to meet with Gandhi. So there's this kind of sense that in those decades something profound has happened, that there will have to be self-rule for India. India is of course not white, so that there's a kind of big sort of seismic challenge to the notions of white supremacy and white self-rule that have congealed from the late 19th century, and of course the rise of Japan as well. It's a big tectonic kind of global shift. Then the second sort of part of that is imperial mobilization for World War II. So the need to mobilize the resources of empire for the collective war effort in Britain. And so you have the kind of British state elites trying to popularize this idea of the war as the people's war, the imperial people's war. So all the peoples of empire coming together to fight Nazism, multiracial kind of people's war. But this never really kind of had the same purchase in popular understandings of the war, as the war is very much a sort of English defiance or English kind of heroism, right? Bleak, but sort of heroic, stoic stand against Nazism, which is captured in the idea of the White Cliffs of Dover, right? So the White Cliffs of Dover are the thing that defends England from the advance of the Nazis. So it has nothing to do with this global imperial multiracial mobilization. And in the post-World War II era as well, there's a kind of the elites, particular state elites, reimagine this imperial history and reimagine their presence in a completely changed world that is now dominated by the US and the Soviet Union in terms of rethinking of the empire as a commonwealth, and also the tensions brought by Commonwealth immigration and the new Commonwealth immigration from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from West Africa, etc. But this doesn't go to the vernacular level. And so this is where the split emerges. And so the popular kind of moments, the ruptures in British politics in the 1950s and 60s are the movements to keep Britain white, right? Popular mobilization to keep Britain white, which is taken up by people, including Churchill, for example, in the 50s. And then Enoch Powell, who's a singular figure who kind of encapsulates this in the 60s, when he makes a famous speech saying, you know, that if immigration from the Commonwealth continues, there will be rivers of blood, right? But what's significant about this speech is that he makes it to protest against the coming race equalities legislation in the late 1960s. He makes it soon after Martin Luther King has been assassinated, but what's really significant about it is that after he's made it, he gets thousands and thousands of letters of fan mail. I mean, it's overwhelming. And there's some, you know, this great kind of anecdote, which is that there were so many letters of fan mail coming for Enoch Powell that the local post office had to put on extra deliveries just to be able to deliver the mail to his kind of constituency office. So what you see there is this real kind of, you know, the kind of the split between the elite and the popular. And this is from Bill Schwartz, who argues that if you think about contemporary whiteness, right? So the global force of anti-colonialism and the civil rights movement from the 50s and the 60s onwards are the thing that reanimate racial whiteness as a political force in the US and in the UK. And you can trace it through the histories of the UK as well. You know, the kind of the emergence of the Southern strategy, etc. Whereas in the UK, Powellism then begins to inform the way in which both Labour and the Conservative Party, who had previously had a consensus about the need for maintaining the Commonwealth, increasingly starting to adopt restrictive immigration legislation. And so this is kind of a quote that sort of sums this up, this multiple pressures on the UK, on these popular conceptions of democracy, decolonization, the civil rights movement. Schwartz has this nice phrase, you know, decolonization, these images of white princesses dancing with Black state leaders of newly independent states, right? This massive kind of shock to vernacular understandings of whiteness. There's this idea that state and official society are turning against the nation and its indigenous people. And so just as you have in India, because of the thinness of colonial modernity, in Britain, it's the shock of decolonization that then leads to a kind of a difference in the sort of the grammars of politics, the conceptions of politics at these two levels. Powell has this nice kind of, in Enoch Powell's speech, one of the kind of the phrases that sort of stands out, and it's been picked up on my numerous kind of people looking at this, is that, you know, in this country, one of his constituents, alleged constituents, says to him, in this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the Black man will have the whip hand over the white man. So that's that kind of fear of being vanquished, being defeated, right? So England has become a vanquished nation. It's become a defeated nation. Having won the war, it's become a defeated nation. And who is to blame for this defeat? Well, it's, you know, it's the Black man, right? It's the people of color who are coming as immigrants. And so the argument then that we will make in this paper, drawing upon the existing research, is that then race is the nodal point through which both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party have in various ways sought to re-enchant British politics, right? In a subliminal way, more or less have sought to re-enchant British politics and have sought to mobilize these kind of vernacular and popular energies. So race is the nodal point through which to understand the disintegration of the nation and the possibilities of national recovery. So for Thatcher, race, but also sexuality, so racial minorities, sexual minorities, become the nodal point for a whole bunch of policies, that economic policies that are normally associated with Thatcherism, like cuts to welfare, attacks on local governments, because of course the people who are benefiting from these welfare provisions, who are running amok in local government, are these Black people and brown people and the militant gays, right? So I mean, that was the language at the time. So it's these sexual and racial minorities that are really kind of they're the cause of they're the reason for England's defeat. And it goes on through New Labour. So this is from Gilroy, very perceptively noted. I completely, although I remember this era, forgotten that, you know, Blair, the New Labour Party also used this, right? So New Labour in the 1997 kind of seminal elections, Tony Blair visits the White Cliffs of Dover. He sort of stands at the White Cliffs of Dover and makes a speech. And before him, the person who'd done that in that election campaign is the leader of the far-right British National Party, right? And also in the New Labour's kind of 1997 party conference, Peter Mandelson brought on a bulldog called Fritz, a British bulldog called Fritz, right? So, Gilroy talks of this as playing with the visceral symbols of nation, race, and empire, and the orchestrators of political opinion imagining they can play with fire and turn it towards their own pragmatic ends, which, you know, they couldn't, because these energies, these kind of affects sort of escaped their control in some ways. So it's, yeah.
So you've got one minute.
1 minute. Okay, sure. Last slide. So yeah, so that's the last slide. So so this kind of re-enchantment, this moment of re-enchantment in British politics is then kind of where we are now. So this is just a picture that gives you a sense of where we are now. So this has happened in the summer of 2020, as there were clashes, or not really clashes, but, you know, far-right protesters in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement took to the streets of central London. And interestingly, super interesting, so much symbolism here, making far-right salutes or Nazi salutes near the cenotaph whilst protecting the statue of Churchill. So, you know, that Churchill has then become a kind of emblem of white supremacy, which it's not, you know, given the history, it's not that unexpected, but yeah, it's the way in which the war has been reinterpreted. So yeah, so that's us. I guess to sum up, it's, you know, what we're looking at is the kind of the ways in which we can think about the disenchantment of democracy and the ways and how it becomes re-enchanted through the use of these vernacular symbols and images.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I'm looking forward to the Q&A to sort of push a few points and to clarify a bit more. Thank you very much, Madura and Moyukh. I guess we now move to Felipe. Thank you.
Thank you, Inderjeet. Thank you, Juvaria, for the opportunity. Let me share my presentation with you. Can you see it?
Yes.
Thank you, Inderjeet. So my presentation is called "To Save the World from Communism: Conspiracy Theories and the Foreign Policy of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro." Jair Bolsonaro, the 2018 elected Brazilian president, is one of the key leaders of a global far-right political movement, whose exact denomination is still under debate by several scholars, going from concepts such as ultra-conservative populism to neo-fascism. Despite their particularities, scholars agree that the leaders of the far-right, from Donald Trump in the United States to Viktor Orban in Hungary, and obviously Bolsonaro in Brazil, are strongly associated with the dissemination of disinformation, fake news, and numerous conspiracy theories, something that plays an important role on what these countries' leaders say and how they act in the international system. This presentation seeks to analyze the conspiratorial worldview that surrounds the government of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and its impacts on Brazil's rhetoric and positions in the world system. We will basically focus on the idea of anti-communism and how it is connected for many Bolsonaro's officials to a sprawling conspiracy theory in which Bolsonaro's foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, is one of the key supporters. To do that, we will have first to briefly discuss what I understand by conspiracy theory before moving to a concise description of Brazil's current political scenario, and then finally to Bolsonaro's government worldview and its impact on Brazilian officials' rhetoric and actions in foreign policy. So, to discuss conspiracy theory, I will follow here University of Miami professor Joseph Usinski's account on the matter. And according to Usinski, and I quote, conspiracy theory is an explanation of past, present, or future events or circumstances that cites as the primary cause a conspiracy, end of quote. In a specific case, conspiracy is, quote, a small group of powerful individuals acts in secret for their own benefit against the common good, end of quote. Of course, conspiracies are not fantasies per se. There were, and still there are, as I speak, conspiracies going on in different political arenas. The Watergate, for example, was a conspiracy, as well as the Iran-Contra scheme in the Reagan administration during the 80s, or the US support for the 1964 military coup in Brazil. There were conspiracies. So the point here is not to deny the existence of conspiracies, but conspiracy theories are different. Conspiracy theories involve not only the understanding that conspiracies are the main cause for a given event or process to happen, but also that the explanation for that specific occurrence is contradicted by the statements of epistemological authorities. Epistemological authorities comprise a transnational network of actors and institutions that are considered able to make knowledgeable claims about certain subjects and areas, normally, but not exclusively, because they produce knowledge based on scientific methods. There are basically two main types of conspiracy theories. There are those which are limited in its scope or reach, usually referring to a single event, JFK assassination, for instance, but there are others that are much broader, linking different events, process, and institutions over time and in space to a single conspiracy. These broader, and to a lack of a better term, structural conspiracy theories are those that interest us most here because today's far-right leaders and governments expose structural conspiracy theories. Bolsonaro, of course, is no exception on this. But who is Bolsonaro after all? Jair Bolsonaro is a retired army captain who became federal deputy in the early 90s in Brazil and ran for president in 2018 under the banner of economic neoliberalism, moral conservatism, anti-corruption, and tough on crime policies, including the right for citizens to defend themselves through the acquisition of firearms. As you can see here in the second photo, he makes this, famous jest, basically thinking that he is pointing a gun at you. As a former army member, Bolsonaro is strongly linked to the army and to the defense of 1964-85 Brazilian military dictatorship. Bolsonaro considers that the regime's anti-communist attitudes saved Brazil from chaos and praises its several human rights violations and authoritarian measures as the correct policies against what he calls leftist terrorism. The story behind Bolsonaro's rise to power is long and complex. Due to time constraints, I cannot go into details here. The important point is that it is widely seen by scholars in Brazil and outside Brazil as the culmination of a process of de-democratization in the country, to use Bernardo Bianchi, Patricia Rangel, and Jorge Chalup's concept, or the weakening of the country's democratic rule, which ramped up after the parliamentary coup that took President Dilma Rousseff from office in 2016 and culminated in the prison of the former president and leader of the Workers' Party, Lula, in 2018, preventing Lula from running for office and opening ways for Bolsonaro's victory. From January 2019 on, when Bolsonaro took power, this process of de-democratization has accelerated considerably in Brazil. Attacks on the media, minorities, social movements, universities, and political institutions, such as the Supreme Court, to name just a few, have been escalating. Military officers dominate more than 1/3 of the government's key posts, including the Ministry of Health during the pandemic. Similar to Trump in 2020, Bolsonaro gives clear indications that he will not accept defeat if he loses re-election in 2022. Given Bolsonaro's wide support within the armed forces and the police, which is also militarized in Brazil, conditions for democratic resistance in Brazil are far worse than in the United States. It is in this domestic context of de-democratization that the conspiratorial views of the Bolsonaro administration need to be interpreted. Even though some members of his administration do not embrace conspiracy theories, many important officials of his administration do, including Bolsonaro himself, who has already proved to be, regardless of his reasons and intentions, a main conspiratorialist himself. The Bolsonaro's government conspiratorial worldview is strongly linked to the international system. This is the reason why key government posts related to foreign affairs, such as the Ministry of Foreign Relations and the President's Foreign Affairs Advisory Group, are in control of conspiracists. One of the president's son, Federal Deputy Eduardo Bolsonaro, also a notorious conspiracist, was the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee until early this year. Maybe no one expresses the Brazilian government conspiratorial views better than the country's foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo. Araújo is a disciple of Olavo de Carvalho, a US-based Brazilian philosopher who is considered the ideological brain of the Bolsonaro administration, much so that some call him, Olavo de Carvalho, Brazil's Steve Bannon. In what does Minister Ernesto Araújo, Olavo's disciple, believe? Before I proceed, let me warn you that my point here is not to identify the numerous inconsistencies, gaps, and contradictions in Araújo's beliefs, nor to provide an in-depth analysis of his motivations, or to undertake a genealogy of his or Olavo de Carvalho's thoughts, showing links between Brazil's and global far-right ideologies. On the contrary, my point here is simply to understand what Minister Araújo says, making links between his conspiracist rhetoric and the foreign policy actions of the Bolsonaro government. Having said that, Araújo is a strong follower of the so-called New World Order conspiracy theory, or globalism, as he calls it. Inspired by Olavo's abundant writings, but somehow upgraded, if we can use such term, by Araújo himself, given his academic background, Araújo holds a language college degree. Globalism refers to the project of world domination formulated by a communist elite that took shape after the end of the Cold War, replacing socialism as the intermediate stage for communism. According to Araújo, the communist elite has captured the process of economic globalization in order to advance its main domination tool, something that he calls nominalism, also known as cultural Marxism, following a concept employed by other global far-right conspiracists, and that is also used by Ernesto Araújo himself. Nominalism, or cultural Marxism, always according to Araújo, can be described as a process by which the communist elite advances its main goal, that is, the complete domination of the world societies through the control of language. In fact, Araújo's nominalism represents a poor adaptation, bordering on plagiarism, of George Orwell's concepts of newspeak and doublethink. What is relevant in Araújo's concept of nominalism is that it has less to do with the instrumentalization of global or multilateral institutions by a communist elite. This vague notion of world government, the establishment of global norms and policies through multilateral institutions bypassing national sovereignties, as we know, is one of the most important attributes of the New World Order conspiracies. In fact, Araújo understands the establishment of this so-called world government just as part of the problem, but not the crucial one. The key element to him refers to how globalism, through nominalism, controls people's thoughts, constituting a kind of end thought system. For those who argue that Marxism has a strong link with economics and that communism is mainly about the collective ownership of society's means of production and so on and so forth, Araújo answers by following his intellectual mentor, Olavo de Carvalho, who has been arguing for years that this global communist elite had understood by the end of the Cold War that one does not need to control the economy to control society. All one needs to do, they claim, is to control the means of production of ideas. That's why globalism has replaced socialism as the intermediate stage for communism. According to Araújo, and here I quote him, you do not have to own manufacturing equipment when you control the mind of those who own these equipment, end of quote. So how does nominalism work, paving the way for globalism? According to Araújo, nominalism deconstructs language, creating a permanent disconnection between words and reality. The global communist elite has been building cultural hegemony by attaching new and strongly fixed meanings to specific words, making up the basis for a new kind of moralism, a rigid form of political correctness, from which no one is allowed to move away. This new moralism constitutes almost a secular religion, according to him. That's why, Araújo points out, nominalism, and therefore globalism, necessarily requires societies in which God and religion have been weakened or are altogether absent, in which God's morality, the clear notion of right and wrong, true or false, does not exist anymore. A quick parenthesis, if I may. It's interesting to see how far-right conspiracy theories, including the case of Araújo's nominalism, turns post-structuralism upside down, using post-structuralist parameters, such as that all knowledge is political and that knowledge always reflects power relations. Araújo implicitly claims that only certain types of knowledge, particularly what I have called before epistemic authority knowledge, are political, while his ideas and those of the far right are different. Not only are they capable of unmasking the political nature of the knowledge produced and spread by the communist elite, unmasking their globalist project thus, but also they reflect the true nature of things and therefore cannot be considered political at all. Going back to nominalism, what are the main examples that Araújo offers in order to show this project of language deconstruction at work? According to him, before the pandemic, the three main nominalist tools for globalism were, first, the ideology of climate change, or climatism, as he calls it, second, gender ideology, and finally, oikophobia, the opposite of xenophobia, or the fact that one should hate his, her own nation, accepting a borderless world. If I had time, I would look into each one of these so-called nominalist tools in detail. Suffice to say, following Araújo, that in all three examples, the global communist elite has hijacked specific words and concepts such as environment protection, climatism, tolerance, gender ideology, and human rights, oikophobia, transforming them into ideology, that is, to him, into fixed norms that cannot be questioned and that have to be implemented robotically by all societies. Araújo claims that in all cases, the communist elite does not care about neither of one of these subjects, environment, gender, or immigrants. In fact, they employ nominalism only as a tool, as an instrument to advance global cultural hegemony, that is, to advance globalism. With the pandemic, according to Araújo, the situation got much worse though. The pandemic provided the perfect opportunity for the global communist elite to put forward an upgrade version of political correctness, what he calls, and I quote, medical correctness. Social distancing, masks, lockdowns, a new form, and a much more efficient form, according to him, of mental and physical concentration camps. I could go on for hours here, cherry-picking parts of Araújo's vast array of conspiratorial beliefs, but I don't have time for that. So my final point is, to what extent this conspiratorial worldview has been shaping Brazil's foreign policy during the Bolsonaro government? As I will briefly show, its influence is significant, unfortunately. It is true that pragmatic sectors of the Bolsonaro administration, reflecting and interacting with the balance of power in domestic affairs and in the international system, have restrained the wildest conspiratorial forces working behind Bolsonaro. There are several examples in this regard, none more transparent than the need for Brazil to keep cordial relations with China, Brazil's first trade partner, second greatest investor, and one of the main sources for vaccines for COVID in Brazil. But Bolsonaro's Brazil have been fighting the forces of globalism and its main instrument, according to Araújo, nominalism, in several ways and on different domestic and international arenas. There are multiple examples in this regard. from the increasing rate of destruction of the Brazilian Amazon tropical forest and the accusation that international organizations, NGOs, and pro-environment world leaders are using these subjects to bypass Brazil's sovereignty, to the world crusade that Araújo and others in the Bolsonaro administration are fighting against abortion and LGBT rights in the name of the so-called family, which means, of course, a male-dominated heterosexual family unit. Not coincidentally, as you can see on the cover of this Brazilian far-right magazine, February 2021 edition, Araújo is considered a hero to Brazil's far-right groups, who see him as waging a kind of a holy war against globalism in the international system. The clearest and the saddest example of Brazil's Bolsonaro fight against nominalism and globalism is the government negationism concerning the pandemic. In the name of freedom and economic liberty, Bolsonaro and his administration, including his Minister of Health, a military officer, deliberately promotes anti-scientific recommendations, including the extensive use of taxpayers' money to produce drugs that have no scientific efficacy against the virus, chloroquine, the same that had been supported by Trump, by the way, widespread negligence to buy vaccines. The federal government only began purchasing vaccines when state governments in Brazil took the matter on their own hands, and the strong opposition against any social distancing measures. In fact, the president stimulates people to live and work as if a public health crisis does not exist. Nothing captured the absurdity of this terrible and sad moment in Brazil better than POE, a respected Brazilian magazine. Yes, here you see Bolsonaro kissing the death. The result, of course, is a national catastrophe. Almost 60,000 deaths, and as I speak, the fact that several Brazilian states are on the brink of collapse, crowded hospitals, shortage of medical supplies, insufficient doses of vaccines. For sure, there are political and economic forces behind Bolsonaro's project. Also, there is a lot of instrumentalization of conspiracy theories by Bolsonaro and his government officials. The point, though, is that the world's ninth largest economy, the second largest country in the Americas, and the country who owns the largest tropical forest on Earth has been taken over by a far-right administration capable of implementing domestic and foreign policies justified by conspiracy theories. Brazil is no United States, for sure. So the impact of Bolsonaro's catastrophe tends to be much smaller than Trump's. But one cannot dismiss the damages inflicted by Brazil's conspiratorial foreign policy in the international arena, especially during a pandemic. Brazil's Bolsonaro is a threat today, not only for democracy, the environment, the rights of workers and minorities, and the rule of law, but also a major threat to global public health. His negligence towards the pandemic is opening ways for the appearance of new COVID variants in Brazil. Needless to say that this may represent the spread of new virus, not COVID-19, but COVID-21. His conspiracy theories are not merely conspiracy theories. They produce real damages to Brazil and to the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Felipe. That was really interesting, and a lot of questions arise as a result of your presentation, and we'll get a chance to address some of those a bit later on. But thank you so much for your talk, so interesting. Okay, we move now then very quickly to Rima from Middlesex University for her presentation, please.
Let me see how I can do this. 1 second, sorry. I need to share a portion of my screen. So hopefully that will come up here. And I can saw a snapshot from my wedding there. So onto the actual presentation. All right. Juvaria, if you can obviously give me the 2-minute warning so I can wrap up. I don't obviously want to go too much far into where we should be having the Q&A discussion. And as this is based on empirical research, I'm aware that I may send people to sleep, but I hope not. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to take a far more localized and empirical take on looking at political consciousness and party identity across the British South Asian middle classes. So this is based on research that I did many years ago. And the research, the data was captured, both sets of the data that I'll discuss was captured before the EU referendum. But I think it's really important to try and analyze some of the emergent themes from the data, particularly within new research that has come to light about the national and transnational political participation, activity, behaviours and orientations around an increasingly diverse and heterogeneous ethnic minority middle class. So the guiding questions around this research and further research on this topic: how do we best conceive of and seek to measure insofar as we can consciousness and identity within the social and political identity frameworks of second generation ethnic minority groups in the UK? And some of the sort of elite top-down discourses that were discussed by the previous speakers, I think would be interesting to reflect on in relation to the research that I'm going to talk to you about today. What can we not capture through these sorts of empirical analytical snapshots about consciousness, identity and political identity? And what are the implications of and potentials for quantitative and mixed methods socio-political research on ethnic minority groups? And indeed trying to link that to wider changing discourses and material structural processes around political systems, and especially transnational political links between diasporas in the UK and quote unquote the homelands. So British South Asian middle class politics, just a snapshot here. So political blackness has been or was an anti-racist identity under which racial minorities in the UK historically mobilised for racial equality and recognition. So the idea essentially of what is good for my race is good for me, which had a clear class dimension to it as well, fostered a strong political community of interest. There has been fragmentation over time of this sort of racial group consciousness and the political solidarities between UK ethnic minority groups. There are a number of reasons for this, and some of those are the model minority framing of some groups and the amplification of Islamophobia against others. There is documented increasing political conservatism amongst socially mobile Indian Hindus, particularly in the UK, and evidence of a transnational Hindutva effect. Despite this, there is still strong, if not linear, and in some cases waning, as I'll discuss later, attachment to the Labour Party across all UK ethnic minority groups in recent years. Recent research by, or publications by Nima Begum and by Eshan in the LSE Impact blog series discussed ethnic minorities and their political attitudes and their mobilizations of these political attitudes through campaigning and through the ballot box around Brexit. So Begum says more ethnic minorities voted for Brexit than have ever voted Conservative. The fact that ethnic minority voting in the referendum didn't conform to party lines reveals the complex political positions taken by members of different ethnic groups. And I definitely think that the class dimension is really important to analyse here. As Eshan said, majority leave numbers were found in some majority South Asian areas that have a largely affluent profile as well. So places like Osterley in West London. NRI seeking democratic political representation in Indian Parliament has been a focus of research around transnational political identities across the South Asian diaspora, such as the dual citizenship bill. This promotes transnational ethnic bonds, participation of the diaspora in quote unquote the development of certain states, particularly Punjab, and it's indicative of the way in which ethnically loyal and socio-economically successful Indian communities in the UK have managed to align themselves with, that should be construction, sorry, top-down constructions of both what a model immigrant as well as a model emigrant is, okay? So what are the defining concepts that I operationalized in this empirical research? So firstly, the idea of political consciousness and then the idea of political party identity. And I drew at the time on a fairly sort of classic literature around political sociology, but I'm mindful, of course, it's been a few years and there has been a spate of sort of extra research in this area. So political consciousness, class, racial, ethnic minority and religious consciousness can, but not always linearly and exclusively, form the strong bases of political expression and mobilization. Consciousness, however, is subjective and it's not always rooted in objective material conditions. We can think about whether group consciousness is essentially embedded in a sense of perceived relative deprivation or status inconsistency as a result. Recent research has shown us about the relationship between subjective social status and populist tendencies, specifically going back to discussion of Brexit. And can we talk about a sense of middle class political consciousness, if we're going to specifically focus on a middle class, an occupationally middle class or socially mobile subset of ethnic minorities in the UK. Political party identity, so effective attachment or lack thereof to a political party that is beyond a preference, is perhaps how we might define political party identity in a loose sense. It is mutable, it's not fixed. It shifts over a life course as a running tally of political evaluations, political knowledge, self-awareness against the changing political climate and party landscape. It is more so than a preference in the sense that it reflects a deep-seated affiliation to a group which engenders pride and loyalty. And it's not necessarily, nor it really does it need to be defensible. In that sense, it can be difficult to capture. It's complex, it's subjective, as I said before. It's not always reflected in voting behaviour, and it's not necessarily a reflection of one's broader political identity, if we consider that also to be a dynamic and subjective construction. So the approach to the research, so I engaged in multivariate quantitative analysis of British election study ethnic minority survey data from 2010. So this particular data set, of course, is quite dated now, but it was really, really useful at the time because of the range of measures around social, class and political identity that it had. As I said, there were measures of political consciousness that I then engaged in sort of a principal components, or what we might call a factor analysis. I used measures of racial, ethnic and class consciousness to create weighted then composite measures of political consciousness. And then I used these in models to analyse party identity by South Asian ethnic group and occupational class type, and I controlled for a number of other factors doing this as well. And then I engaged in thematic analysis of semi-structured interviews, so accounts of political consciousness and party identity from 22nd generation British, South Asian, Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi professionals. And hopefully I think I will actually, making good time, hopefully have the time to discuss the findings of the latter with you as well today. So as I said, there we go. So as I said, I identified a range of variables, a range of measures within this particular data set to try and operationalize race or ethnic minority consciousness and class consciousness. So the survey measures that I drew on, and you can see some of them on the left-hand side today, measure minority representation in politics, views on majority versus minority will, evaluations on the benefits of pro-Black and Asian political action. So that's specifically around the idea of a minority ethnic identity. It was difficult though to identify measures of class consciousness. Most of these in the data set were around views on trade unions, trade union membership, wealth and inequality, nationalisation, privatisation, workers' rights. And although the researcher said these generally seem to reflect what we might call sort of a sense of left of centre political identity or chime with those, the diffuseness around class made it sort of somewhat harder to try and come to an understanding of which of these variables best capture class consciousness. Okay. Again, I went back to this, I mentioned this idea of middle class consciousness earlier that I want to come back to. And it might seem antithetical and maybe slightly oxymoronic to talk about middle classness and consciousness together. It's really difficult, first of all, to ascertain whether there is such a thing, to ascertain what the basis of a middle class political consciousness might be. And I don't know whether any of you looked at The Guardian today, but Sam Friedman from the LSE talked about some research about the co-optation of working class subjective identities across the professional middle classes. So I decided to operationalize, conversely, a sense of working class or worker class identity, or worker solidarity identity. Bearing in mind that you cannot equate the variables that I chose in this model with either racial and ethnic consciousness or class consciousness linearly, okay? So again, I mentioned some of the variables to represent ethnic and racial consciousness. So things about more Black and Asian people in Parliament are better for ethnic minorities. They represent Black and Asian interests better. Ideas around the will of the majority versus the will of the minority, about the protection of majority versus minority culture, and this idea of the government giving special treatment to minorities. And then those that reflected class consciousness were around the need for strong trade unions, the idea of there being one law for rich and poor people, nationalisation, again, unionisation, so on and so forth. So what I did then was carry out this principal components or factor analysis, which identified latent sentiments that were shared across these two sets of class and racial ethnic minority consciousness. And the left-hand side column on that left figure that you can just see are the components that I have now. So these are weighted composite measures that combine class and race and ethnic group consciousness that I talk about now as political consciousness in the modelling. Okay, so this idea of pro-Black and Asian political representation, pro-agitation, pro-socioeconomic equality, pro-minority will, pro-welfarism, and pro-affirmative action. So loose composite measures across class, race, ethnic minority consciousness. So the factors then in the bar chart on the right compare the mean estimate for the middle class and non-middle class South Asian respondents in that particular data set, allowing us to see the extent to which consciousness differs and thus may be dependent on objective class positioning. The non-middle class South Asian sample is on average more pro-welfare, more pro-affirmative action. The middle class is somewhat more pro-socio-economic equality, holding stronger views about wealth disparity and socio-legal inequality, which will be interesting to juxtapose with the qualitative findings later on. So it seems the middle class sample is sort of more positive about the need and worth of ethnic minority political and parliamentary representation, which could potentially suggest a heightened sense of political efficacy for the South Asian middle classes, motivated to effect group uplift. And the most important thing is this group materially have the resources, the economic resources anyway, to do so. But do they want to is another question, okay? The dependent variable in the modelling was a fairly crude construction of left versus right party identity. Okay, so there was a variable measuring political party identification with a range of political parties, and I subsumed these into left of centre parties and right of centre parties purely here for purposes of statistical analysis. And I'm very, very well aware that Labour, Lib Dem, the Green Party in respect have very wildly different political kind of ideologies, as do the right of centre party that comprise that right of centre group, Conservative, UKIP and BNP. But what the data shows you is across the Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and then across the full South Asian sample, and this is specifically the South Asian middle class sample, you've got sort of an overwhelmingly left of centre party identity leaning group, okay? Particularly for the Pakistani group and the Bangladeshi group, although we have a very small sample size in the latter, but even for the Indian group, you've got nearly 3/4 of Indian middle-class respondents stating that they vote for, not just vote for, but their party identification is aligned with Labour, the Lib Dems, Green Party and or Respect, okay? So what I did then was carried out some hypothesis testing to try and understand across which political consciousness indicators this left-right dimension was significant for. And then I plugged this variable into a logistic regression model, controlling for a range of factors, including age, gender, place of birth, region, marital status, class, operationalized by professional and managerial versus non-professional managerial, and ethnicity. And I created interaction terms so I could essentially see the relationship between political consciousness, which in this model specifically looked at pro-affirmative action, ethnicity, and class. Okay, so this was one of a number of models I ran with across all of these measures of political consciousness and across a range of dependent variables, including political activity and so on and so forth. Very small sample size here, obviously. Generally, it's difficult, obviously, to find data on ethnic minority groups, specifically if you're going to drill down into sub-ethnic group and class as well. The results weren't incredibly interesting in this particular model. There was, as you can see in model 2, a regional effect here, quite a strong regional effect. what the interaction terms show us is that a 1 unit increase in pro-affirmative action sentiment, so this idea that we should essentially, if I go back here, the government should give special treatment to minorities, and also the idea that private enterprise is not the best for economic problems. Okay, considerably increases the odds of left over right-wing political party identity for professional or managerial Pakistanis in relation to non-professional or managerial Pakistanis. Although the same effect doesn't hold for the Indian group, it does tell us that consciousness is a significant factor in the relationship between class and political party orientation for this particular group. Okay. And I didn't have time today to sort of branch out into those other models, but there were similar findings in some of the other models as well, that extended not just to the Pakistani, but to the Indian group as well. So in terms of the qualitative findings and the qualitative data and what I could tap when I interviewed the respondents about political party identity and orientation, there was a strong sense of ambivalence or internal complexity in expressions of party identity across the majority of the interview participants. And I'd also asked them about their class and their ethnic identity as well. And there was ambivalence in there as well. And so there was definitely a relationship between the two. There was a change across time, essentially, as well, and an instrumentality related to perceptions of parties' track records on business and taxation, which was quite a surprising finding for me, as I'd only sampled professionals and not managers, or a huge amount of sort of businessmen in this particular sample. So one of the respondents says, when I was at university, I was fundamentally a socialist, but at the moment I opened my own business, I became a fundamentalist capitalist. So the interview data was really, really interesting in order to capture respondents' perceptions of changes over time in terms of their political identity, which obviously cross-sectional quantitative analysis can't really afford you. Indian respondents tend to engage in negotiation with their parents and their own political positioning over time, as I said, particularly in relation to intergenerational upward mobilities. So I think that was definitely captured in that earlier quote that I gave you. And there were really strong Blairite tendencies across the Indian respondents as well. So they were very stuck between, you know, I know that historically we have voted for Labour, we, as in my ethnic group, but I'm incredibly disillusioned by them at the moment. And this was obviously at the time when Corbyn was at the helm, and they said Tony Blair, a lot of them said Tony Blair would have been my ideal Labour Party man. Those who described themselves as left-wing with strong views on equality, justice, minority representation were generally strong Labour sympathisers. And you could see that a sense of a marginalised religious identity and a working class identity interacted meaningfully to create a left-wing and civic-minded political identity. This was characterised most acutely amongst the working class Bangladeshi Muslim interviewees. And I have to say that it was largely the Bangladeshi and Pakistani interviews who came from working class backgrounds in the sample itself. These were, again, the only subset of the sample who broached the problematics of elite EU referendum discourse and reflected on whiteness and race in political party discourses. This was quite a reflexive and intellectualized discourse as well that I didn't really see reflected in the discourses of the Indian participants. So what are the key findings here? So Labour Party identifications hold strong even amongst middle-class South Asians, but there are notable exceptions from Indian Hindus, and political conservatism is exhibited across the board in Pakistani and the Bangladeshi groups as well, often instrumentalised in relation to their economic and business interests. Political consciousness based on class and racial ethnic solidarity mediates, but only in places, the relationship between class, ethnicity, and political party orientation. And the types of political consciousness, so group solidarities they harbour, interact with occupational class position and determine in part, particularly for British Pakistanis, the party identities they hold, and in other modelling I've shown the level to which they engage politically and civically in UK politics. So there are a huge amount of limitations here that I'm very, very sort of reflexive about in the research itself. You know, not only the measurement around these particular phenomena, but the predictive power of class and minority ethnic identity on political engagement and political orientations. There are lots of things that were not captured in that data. So class background, parents' political orientations, not just in the UK, but in their home countries, experiences and rationalizations of discrimination and feelings of status inconsistency. So we do need longitudinal and further mixed methods approaches across ethnic minority data sets to explore the subjective meanings of the different facets of social and political identity and the complexity of their subjective and material dimensions. One thing that I did find was that religious victimization as well as class background goes a long way to understanding why and how some, albeit economically successful groups or individuals, particularly hyper-racialized Muslim South Asians, feel socially and politically excluded and underrepresented. But that's not to say that other groups don't feel that as well. So Indian Hindus and Sikhs also express sense of religious victimization, and these have different manifestations over time, and we can see it contemporarily. This is sort of anecdotal as well as the emergent research in the area, that discourses between the diaspora and the homeland are really important here in terms of sort of the political priorities of British South Asians, not just on what's going on back home, quote unquote, but in the UK, you can see the Hindutva effect and transnational ethno-religious solidarities around farmers are becoming increasingly salient. So I guess that is essentially a very important area of research going on from here. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So I hope that was all right time-wise.
Great, thank you very much,
Excellent.
Rima.
Thanks so much.
It was really interesting. And we can now move to the Q&A. It's interesting that we moved, if you like, from the macro to the national to the micro. And I've got lots of questions myself in regard to the way in which each of you has analyzed some really big macro processes that are going on. But I'll move first to the questions on the chat, on the Q&A among our audience first. And the first question is for you, Felipe. The person asks, what role do you think the national news plays in keeping Brazilian people on Bolsonaro's side?
I think that the mainstream media is considered by Bolsonaro and his allies as part of this globalist conspiracy theory. So the main media is not part of the process. Of course, that before the election, the main media played a role in terms of criticizing the Workers' Party here in Brazil and helped to get Bolsonaro elected. But by now, the main point is related to the social media, how Bolsonaro uses the social media and messaging apps such as WhatsApp, Facebooks, to spread conspiracy theories among his followers. And also, of course, that you have some, national TV channels and some, growing right-wing papers and magazines, but they are not, the main point. I think social media and messaging apps are the basic idea for us to understand how these things and these ideas spread for Bolsonaro's base group.
Thank you. There's a question, I think, which seems to be probably directed at Madura and Moyukh, but I think it could be taken up by Felipe as well, perhaps. Neil Lingwer asks, have you considered the idea that locals in the UK and maybe Brazil also have a feeling that with time they may become a minority in their own countries? By locals is meant Anglo-Saxons. Now, there does seem to be in each case, in India, Britain and Brazil, and then of course you could extend it to the United States case too, of a feeling of loss, of cultural loss, national loss, loss of control, that something is being taken away from me, my country, and we want our country back. And I just wonder, why would you say, just to add to that question, is why do you think that tendency seems to have grown so powerful in the same sort of time period in each of the examples that we've looked at today? I wonder if we could go to Madura and Moyukh for that first.
So shall I go first, Moyukh? Is that, yeah,
Sure.
Go ahead. Okay. The question about do Anglo-Saxons feel like they're going to become a minority, that's yes. I mean, that's clearly true that that's part of the discourse. But what's interesting, of course, is that they feel a minority as Anglo-Saxons, right? So it's the kind of constitution of us as Anglo-Saxons that is kind of interesting, because one of the key things is that when the kind of the violence against immigrants from the West Indies occurred in the 1950s and 1960s in Notting Hill and Nottingham, Moyukh and I were laughing, like, if this was happening in India, we'd just call it a riot or a pogrom, right? It would be a pogrom. That is a pogrom, right? Which happened in Notting Hill and in other places. What's really interesting is that actually the numbers of migrants from the West Indies and South Asia at that time was really minimal compared to the immigration from Europe, from Italy, from Poland, from Ukraine, from these other countries. So there were hundreds and thousands of kind of post-war immigrants from Europe that were coming to Britain at the same time. But it was actually the kind of the immigrants of color that were focused on. So I would say that it's that race that's significant. And also look at the poster with Farage, right? We're leaving the EU, but we're leaving the EU to get away from these brown people. So that it's that constitution that's significant. And as for the second question of like, why are they all happening at the same, that is the really kind of interesting question as to how these things are connected at the material level, the socio-political level, the kind of global economic crisis, and the way in which the ideas are connected as well. But I think that's really key. I mean, there are lots of similarities here from Felipe's discussion of Brazil as well. I mean, it's so familiar to the British case, to the Indian case, even I would say to the Sri Lankan case as well. But I don't have a clear answer for that question.
Moyukh, would you like to come in on any of this?
Yes, sure. Thank you. So yeah, thank you. The question is, I think, very important, and I think the question, the two ways to think about the question of the majority and minority. So at the outset, of course, yes, Hindus were statistically a majority in India. Many Hindus have sympathizers and now believe that they will become a minority. They are already a minority. So at the outset, yes, that feeling is common, popular, and increasing every day. But I think the way to perhaps think about it is that one is the statistical, quantitative understanding of majority and minority, which is sort of basis of democratic politics. And there is something to that within democracies, the urge and the necessity of cleaving societies and the polity into those majorities and minorities. But it is a political process. So to produce majorities and minorities politically is a question of theme, affiliations, alliances, political issues. What is happening in India, and I mean, I cannot speak for other contexts here, they're the experts here who can speak to their context, but is an effort to construct a permanent majority. So a permanent majority and a permanent minority. So to construct Muslims as permanent minorities in India, and therefore they become almost irrelevant to the political process, because if they are permanent minorities, they do not count. They're always already going to be minorities. So, and the Hindus are therefore the permanent majority. So the processes of majoritarianism and minoritization, in that sense, partake of a huge, broader public culture, symbols, motifs, the whole range of things that Felipe was mentioning, in his example, especially his attention to ideas, the importance of the ideas. So I think we need to separate these two and to understand them, to understand these two, the idea of the majority and minority, of course, quantitatively, but also in a broader sense. And as for the comparisons, I think it's too early. I'm just absorbing all the information I got, so it would be too early for me to lay out any comparisons. But I think the differences are also very important in the different contexts that came out, and a serious attention to the differences in especially Brazil and India, for instance, in the way the societies have handled COVID, would warn us against too easily jumping into some kind of thing like, it's just the same Modi, Bolsonaro, same guy, same thing. Felipe's presentation alerted me to the differences, the significant differences between India and Brazil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Felipe, I just wonder, just sort of picking up on the presentation that Moyukh and Madura made, where they talk about this kind of sort of the development of liberalism and democracy alongside its kind of opposite of colonialism and slavery and empire, and how the kind of certain tendencies get submerged with the sort of official state kind of ideology of liberalism and tolerance and diversity, and then re-emerge and erupt, in fact, later on. Can you apply the same kind of approach to the Brazilian case, would you say?
Yes, I think it's possible to make some reflections on these developments, Inderjeet, because in Brazil, the slavery is a major issue, and the way violence connected labor, and entrepreneurs along Brazil's history. But I would also point to the relevance of Latin America's Cold War, and then I make the connection with another question that you posed in terms of minority, because for Bolsonaro's rise, immigration was not an issue, was not a major issue. Of course, that we had Haiti, we had Venezuela, some people from Latin America that were coming to parts of South America and Brazil also as well. But immigration was not the main point. The main point is connected to good citizens and bad citizens, and how you kind of, in Brazil, you have this notion of internal enemy, and how this was strongly shaped by Latin America's Cold War, by internal communism and authoritarian regimes. Bolsonaro is strongly connected with Brazilian armed forces. So you have this notion of minority, but the idea that because of corruption or violence, urban violence, so good citizens, they are becoming a minority in the country, and Bolsonaro is there for them to push back. So this is one point. And when it comes to what you said in terms of comparisons, I think there are structural tendencies. If Madura said the economic crisis, I would say the fact that we have different means of information. If you look at history, every time when you have a revolution in terms of means of communication and information, if you look at the development of the press in the 15th and 16th century, if you look at the radio, if you think about mass newspapers, every time when you have a major development in how people get information, you have also some upheavals in how elites and the population connects or not, among them. So these are some of the thoughts that but he had to connect how these structural developments are related to particular developments in different places of the world. These are some of the things that I would like to, to pose here in this great discussion.
And it was interesting when you mentioned that there's some kind of ideologue who's considered to be Brazil's Stephen Bannon, so that there are equivalent roles played, but I think increasingly, as you said, the world is much more easily interconnected through social media, but also through the fact that there's a kind of rise of right-wing internationalism, if you like, and kind of some entrepreneurs who are promoting those kinds of linkages and connections, or trying to promote them as much as they possibly can. So yeah, it's really very interesting. I'd like to ask Rima to take a question.
Yeah, there's two actually that I think I can probably draw on. Two really, really good questions. One from Abid Ali, who says, did you segment based on granular ethnicity? The majority of Indian origin British are Gujarati, East Asian background, absolutely. Pakistanis, majority Kashmiris, who don't always identify as Pakistani, Punjabis, mostly Sikh. And then obviously there are differential sort of political leanings that sort of have a long history back in India as well. And he mentions the idea of support of Khalistan in Canada, US, Britain. We're definitely seeing that coming now, the sort of mainstreaming, I guess, of the support of Khalistan across Punjabi Sikh populations, second and third generations, not just first generations in the UK. So in the quantitative analysis, I couldn't segment by granular ethnicity because obviously attrition of sample size, but I definitely did in the, sorry, I'm looking really whitewashed here, but I definitely did segment in the interviews, and these absolutely came up organically. I had some respondents bypassing what we might classify in the UK as their ethnic identity. So talking about how they're Gujarati instead of Indian first and foremost. One of the respondents specifically said, I like to say that I'm Gujarati because this is where Modi was from. So you do definitely get a sense of pride. Yes. We can talk about the reflexivities as trying to keep a straight face in interviews. So there was definitely sort of a sense of a transnational as well as a national sort of ethnic pride in these granular, or what I call sort of sub-ethno-regional identities. So really, really important to take that into account, and not only in terms of identification, but in terms of sort of the different levels of economic, cultural and social capital that these groups brought with them, depending on, you know, how these groups were wielded and framed and given kind of varying levels of sort of what we might call kind of economic and political sort of responsibility during colonial times as well. So it's important to go all the way back there to understand that. So really, really great point from Abid. Bamo says, what would you argue best explains the rise of conservatism amongst ethnic minority groups in the UK, especially in the working class? What a question. I mean, if Madura or Moyukh or Felipe, you know, even want to sort of discuss that as well. You know, I would say, you know, kind of instrumental reasons, the economics. You know, we saw that quote from the guy who said, I'm a fundamentalist capitalist. And 20 years ago, he was a fundamentalist socialist. But it's not that simple. There's so many dimensions of this. Class being one of them. Consciousness, obviously, is a function of social identity frameworks, is a mediator, as I found in my research as well. And, you know, it's grappling with these hegemonic discourses and these elite discourses. Do you want to frame yourself away from the model minority myth if it's worked for you so far? You know, so such a wide ranging but important question there from Bamo. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rima. I'd like to move to a question which looks particularly interesting and can bring in Moyukh and Felipe as well. Where he says, Raj Patel says, it seems that both in the case of Brazil and Brexit, that the right have exploited the idea of an external threat. So is the rise of populism in India different from, well, although I guess Pakistan is just a minor issue in Indian domestic politics, but is a large part of Modi's kind of appeal, mass appeal, focused around external threats, or is it kind of beyond that?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the internal threat, yeah, I mean, I remember Felipe also used that term, and so I think it is right to say that the history or the history and the evolution of populism in India is very different from what is happening in Europe right now. India has a long history of populist politics, and it's across the aisle, and so notwithstanding that, the question of the internal threat, I think the Hindu nationalist movement has used, and continues to use Pakistan and as an external threat, but the externality of Pakistan is of course internal, because what it is it's about Muslims. And the fact that there is a Islamic nation that is as a neighbor, and which then gives them a reason to both complain and of course produce a foreign policy, but also produce a domestic policy, a rule of law, a form of I want to say public culture, where Pakistan / Muslim / infidel or the loyalties of people who live with us but are not here in this territory. So that idea is very powerful, and is, if you just by anecdotally, if you see the quality, the number of times Pakistan appears in WhatsApp messages, in right wing, what Felipe was describing, this vast infrastructure of misinformation, rumors, whatever you want to call it, Pakistan is right there, center, and very important to understand.
Okay, thank you. On to Felipe. There's a question for you from Alcindo L, who says that assuming Bolsonaro does have a second term of office, especially if he's got the police and the military, and he said he's not going to leave, and that obviously there could be a stolen election, and therefore he's a legitimate president again. What do you think of the impacts on the Brazilian foreign policy then?
Inderjeet, I cannot think about this possibility, to be very, because we still have 2 years to the end of Bolsonaro's first term, and I don't think that the country really can go on like this. The situation is unbearable right now. So to think about Bolsonaro getting reelected, or the fact that everything is pointing to this direction, that he may not recognize the results of the elections and get support from the armed forces and the police to continue in power, the results in terms of domestic policy, international policy for Brazil, and I would say also to Latin America and part of the world, it's a catastrophe, really a catastrophe. So I don't have really words to express the threat that we are facing here in Brazil with this conspiracy theory driven government. And making connection with the question that you posed before, there is this notion of external threat. They're connected to internal threat. So this global communist elite is connected to leftists in Brazil. So they see the Workers' Party, those social movements that work for minorities, environmentalists, NGO that work to protect the forest, and everything for them is connected to this global conspiracy and an internal and external threat. They are mainly linked. So that's what makes so difficult to have a conversation, to have a dialogue. We're talking really about a bubble, and it's difficult to penetrate into this bubble. So, I really don't want to think about the possibility, even though as a social scientist and an internationalist, I think that we have to be honest about the fact that the threat is real for Bolsonaro, not only to stay in power, but to really create a damage in Brazil and in the area that is going to be, for a very, very, very long time.
So would you say then, I mean, this is a question from Madura, Moyukh, and Rima, if you would like to contribute as well. It's just the last question as we're running out of time. Is your argument that these tendencies, which have been developing for a long time and have erupted or manifested in particular ways periodically, is it now different from previous periods in which these sorts of symptoms have been manifest, such that it's now a structural and visible element of the political landscapes of these of these countries, such that this is not just going to get submerged again, but actually it is so powerful and legitimate in the eyes of so many that it's going to be now part of the normal political landscape. Just like people are saying about the United States and the Republican Party and what kind of party it is has become, that it's not going to just disappear, like Trumpism without Trump and so on. So Brexit and without Farage and the Johnsons and these others. And then, Hindutva beyond Modi. So is there something different, would you say? Because it is so visible and above ground and so powerful in some, the kind of media and within the armed forces, the whole kind of political society.
Should I begin?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you look at Brazil's history, we have always, during the 20th century, we had this fringe, far-right movements and even fascist movements during the 30s and 40s. But we are talking here about 5%, 10% max of the population. Bolsonaro really represented something different. We're talking, he was elected almost, 50% of the population, in the runoff elected him. And someone who praises torture, someone who praises, the dictatorship. So it is something different in the sense that the popularity that these far-right positions have gained in Brazil is something that really is something new in Brazil's history, for sure. And the fact that you have this bubble protecting the way the information, of these conspiracy theory-driven people, put together, these bubbles end up making very, very difficult to penetrate, and at the same time allows kinds of, far-right movements to go on, even if they don't keep in power formally. But the main point in Brazil is that, as I said, that Bolsonaro has support from the armed forces and the police, and this is the main thing that I believe can create a serious problem in 2022 when the election is going to happen. So yes, my answer to your question is yes, and it's a very, it's new and it's a challenging times that we're going through.
Thank you. Madura, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good question. So I would say kind of two things. One from the British perspective, and then thinking more globally. I think from the British perspective, there is something significant here. Of course, if you look back at these readings, race has continued to be nodal in the post-World War II era. But what's happening now is that this kind of configuration around Brexit is allowing and is also happening at a time when there is also just a disintegration of other institutions of British political life. So you can see that there's a disintegration of media culture, there is a disintegration of parliamentary procedure. Johnson suspended Parliament, there's an attack on judges. It doesn't seem as close as Brazil, but if you look, there are somewhat distinct patterns from what you might have seen in the 80s. So Thatcher never said, I'm going to tear up this international treaty.
Yeah.
She never said that, right? To please her base. She never said that. And I would think that section of the Conservative Party would be slightly appalled by that at that time, right? So that's somewhat different in the British case. What I would say in the global case is there's something different. As Moyukh said, there are some similarities, but there's something different about these different figures, Bolsonaro, Trump, Farage, whatever. And I would say that there's the line that divides them is the white supremacy line. So if you think about anti-communism and white supremacy, the reassertion of white supremacy in the post-World War II era is linked to anti-communism, very closely linked to anti-communism in the US, in Brazil, the Cold War in Latin America, and the violent Cold War in Latin America, and in Britain too. So Enoch Powell has this famous speech, much more potent than the Rivers of Blood speech, where he talks about the enemy within, right? It linked to racial minorities, linked to students, linked to hippies, linked to sexual minorities, linked to the communists. It's kind of like the conspiracy that Felipe talked about, doing all these terrible things, right? These people are different from the Modis, the Xi Jinping, Erdogan, for example, because those people are from the global south, right? So they don't have that same antagonism to the international in the same way. They don't. Modi and Xi Jinping and Erdogan are not trying to torch international institutions. In fact, people will be appalled when I say this. Modi on the international is not that far away from Nehru on the international, right? Not that far away, even when it comes to Kashmir, sadly, right? So there's something different about the authoritarians from the global south who actually are becoming globally more powerful in some way, right? And who have a different relationship with the institutions of international order than those from, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon North, but also in Brazil's case, that dividing line between the side that sided with the anti-communists and the side that identifies with the global south, right? Because the global south and the line runs through Latin America and particularly Brazil, right? It runs through Brazil in a way. So, yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is that, of course, the structural position and the development in the recent past of India and Brazil and other global south countries and economies, if you like, is kind of later than the sort of neoliberal Anglo-Saxon, and so that the kind of the level of disintegration and deindustrialization and the kind of hollowing out of trade unions and the left broadly, I guess, has kind of occurred. It is quite an advanced stage, whereas I suppose with the statist policy still probably followed right through till about the 1990s in the main, have relatively less time to mature, but they're certainly or whatever's happening, this kind of this decay, which is, I guess, is happening, is there's a greater level of vigor and growth and so-called progress, development within the kind of global South states currently. So maybe there's that kind of historical time differences, but I'm really sorry. We have actually gone way beyond our time, and Tanya will be telling me off later on because we all need to get going somewhere else. But well, it's such an interesting discussion, and I think there's so many more questions I would have for Rima also about the micro level movement of people and their ideas and consciousness as things change. And I would have liked to sort of ask her a lot more about other communities where she has knowledge of kind of the empirical kind of identities, political shifts, and so on. But sadly, we always have to stop our discussions. But I really want to say thank you very much to Madura and to Moyukh and to Rima and to Felipe for such a wonderful set of presentations, and very interestingly and curiously interconnected, but also enabling us to see some big distinctions and differences, which I think should be fed into our analysis when we sort of very easily and casually mention Bolsonaro and Modi and Trump and so on in one breath as representing the same symptoms of the same kind of phenomenon. So thank you very much. That's a fantastic discussion. There was loads of questions I couldn't ask you from the Q&A as well. But thank you very much to the audience also. Next week we're back, same time, same place. We're going to be talking about the OECD and the IMF and the World Bank and the whole concept of knowledge and development politics. So we've got 3 or 4 or maybe more speakers next week. Really interesting. And we'll send out those tweets and stuff like that. But for this week, thank you very much, everyone. And have a great weekend and enjoy life. Bye-bye.